second part of our interview with Mr. Paul Boateng, a recently elected member of the British Parliament. We put this question to the Vice Moderator of the World Council of Churches Committee to Combat Racism. This is probably an unfair question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. What kind of economic system do you think Christianity demands or requires?
It demands an economic system in which greed and avarice are not seen as the prime movers of the system. It requires an economic system in which there is a recognition of the value of cooperative work, of people coming together, of people sharing. It requires an economic system that does not tolerate hunger and poverty and the disfigurement of God's creation. That's the Christian imperative. But you must understand that the Bible and the Gospels are not a party political agenda. There is no manifesto as such. What there is a spirit, what there is a demand for justice, and that has to be contained and that has to be developed within not only our own personal lives and our own personal relationship with God, but also within our public institutions as well. That's a great challenge.
Given the standard that you just mentioned in terms of what the economic system that Christianity requires, the Bible requires, how does the economic system in the United States, how does the economic system in Britain square with that?
The fact of the matter is that this world, the great economic systems of this world, the capitalist system and the Soviet system, with its emphasis on state power, with its emphasis on regimentation, with its lack of respect for individual freedom, the capitalist system with its emphasis on grab and take what you can, and the devil take the hindmost. Neither of those two systems.
The devil take the what now?
Devil take the hindmost. That's a British expression that means that if you come last, if you're not a winner, tough. The devil take you.
Okay.
Because coming first is a sign of God's grace. Coming last or somewhere near the bottom is a sign of God's lack of favor. That's a very dangerous philosophy and creed. So when I look at the capitalist system, when I look at the Soviet system, I do not find systems in conformity with the will of Christ. And the challenge for us is to find a way that is in conformity. It's not easy. It's hard. But then no one said when Paul and Barnabas went on their great missionary journeys, when Peter took up the cross for Christ in the world, no one said it was going to be easy. It isn't. But it is something that we are required to do to find a better way. And it can be done.
I was looking at your list of lecture topics earlier. And there was one there entitled Rendering Unto Caesar. What's that? Christianity and Politics, a reappraisal. Could you give us a summary of that?
My concern is that all too often in this world in which we live, we refuse to accept and we refuse to recognize the importance of the spiritual in our lives. And when we approach politics, we see it in terms of ideology and dogma, whether of the left or of the right, that doesn't recognize the importance of spiritual growth within the individual and indeed within the institutions which we develop and contribute to as human beings. And I think we need a reappraisal that says that Christianity must not be hijacked by either the left or the right in politics, that faith and the spiritual content of our lives, whether it's Christian or Buddhist or Hindu or Mohammedanism, mustn't be used for a party political purpose, but must be seen as the inspirers and the motivators of new and more just and more equal systems. So spirituality and faith should be a grounding for action. And that's how it seems to me we need to approach these issues now, not in the narrow and dogmatic way that you see in some aspects of what you call in America, I believe, the new right, the fundamentalist right, rather sinister men who lie behind much of the political thinking that is currently going on in your country and some of the political thinking that is going on in mine. We shouldn't see the Christian faith in those terms, but likewise we shouldn't see faith in the terms that it's seen, say, in Iran, when you have a rigid fundamentalist doctrine imposed as a political ideology. Those approaches to faith, whether, as I say, whether they are Christian or from some of the other world's great religions, it seems to me aren't in conformity with true spiritual values.
What would you say have been the biggest accomplishments of the World Council of Churches?
I think to provide an arena in which Christians can come together internationally and ecumenically from different denominations to establish a world agenda for Christ.
Have you been accused of being too action-oriented, too political?
Of course, we've been accused of being too action-orientated. We've been accused of being a Marxist front. Absolute nonsense, of course, because the fact of the matter is, as you will appreciate, that the Soviet Union finds, and with cause, Christianity to be a major subversive influence. Because indeed true spirituality is subversive of political systems that are not in conformity with it.
Say that again now, say that again. Right.
True Christianity is subversive of political institutions that are not in conformity with the teachings of the gospel of Christ. Therefore, it seems to me, if we are called subversive by United States capitalists on the one hand and Soviet communists on the other, then we are fulfilling the mission of Christ. Because Christ has to be opposed to unjust systems.
How does that stand up in the face of rendering unto Caesar? That's getting back to what I was...
Well, rendering unto Caesar the things that are Caesar.
Because you have this interpretation in many circles.
But it's a completely false interpretation. If you examine St. Paul, if you examine what he is saying, what he is saying and doing in terms of the issue of church and state, if you examine Christ's response when he was given the coin and avoided the trap of the Pharisees, what the Christian message says is that do not try and escape the world. You are part of the world in which you live, but within that world you have specific responsibilities as a Christian, and they are part and parcel of your total beingness as a human, and you can't escape them. They're opposite sides of the same coin. You cannot divide your spiritual life from your civic life. The one informs the other. Do you follow me? So it's not a question of Christianity being a party political manifesto, but it is a question of Christianity as being the touchstone, the inspiration of your faith and of your action.
What is the World Council of Churches' position on South Africa?
The World Council of Churches' position on South Africa is quite clear and quite unambiguous. We range ourselves wholeheartedly beside and behind the forces of liberation in the continent of Africa. And we range ourselves behind and with the liberation movements, with ANC, with SWAPO, with PAC. We range ourselves in support of the South African Council of Churches and the Namibian Christian Council, because they are the legitimate representatives of the people of Southern Africa in terms of ANC, SWAPO and PAC, and the South African Council of Churches and the Namibian Christian Council are doing the work of Christ in the region, and we are one with them.
What kind of support has the church given the freedom fighters,
direct,
to use President Reagan's word.
The special fund, I'm not sure that President Reagan would describe the ANC, SWAPO and PAC
or maybe it was
as
somebody
freedom
else.
fighters. I think he's got a rather different and completely inaccurate term for them. I would certainly describe them.
Call them the Nicaraguans. I just use his term, you know.
I would
the Contras.
I would certainly call SWAPO, ANC, and PAC freedom fighters. And the special fund of the World Council of Churches, and we're quite clear about this, gives humanitarian aid to the liberation movements. We say that those people are acting in conformity with the will of God, and that as Christians we have to put ourselves side by side with them. Now that's a very controversial thing that the World Council of Church is saying. It has brought great wrath upon the head of the World Council of Churches, but then Christ never told us it was going to be easy. And that is why it is so particularly important that the black churches should take up the banner for freedom in South Africa. We look to the black churches and black Christian people to be saying to their denominations, support the special fund of the World Council of Churches, support the liberation movements, give them a place in your churches, let them preach from your pulpits, because they are preaching in conformity and speaking in conformity with the will of God. And what's so sad, you know, Mr. Middleton, is that all too often our black churches, who know, after all, about struggle, who know about sacrifice, somehow believe that now is the time to forget those things and to put themselves to one side and say, well, now we can be concerned about other matters. We've moved on. We don't want to hear about the movement anymore. We don't want to hear about liberation anymore. Well, they have to hear and they have to do if they are continue to be that. If they're to continue to be that dynamic force for Christ that the black churches have always been.
What is the black church like in Britain?
The black church in Britain really is comprised of two particular aspects. Black Christians everywhere, both within the main denominations and within black-led churches, and black-led churches. So the black church, I myself am a member, am a Methodist. Now the Methodist is not a black denomination. My own church happens to be a majority black. We are part of the black church. We're also part, of course, of the wider church in Britain. But there are also particularly Pentecostal churches and other black churches in Britain who are separate from the mainstream churches and who are developing a growing social awareness of the importance of the role of the church in the community. And in that they have much to learn from you all in the United States.
Okay. Some psychologists maintain that racism is a mental disorder. In your travels, what are some of the things that you've learned about the racist mind?
The racist mind. I'm not sure that such a thing exists. Racism for white people is a political and administrative convenience. It perpetuates their power. There's nothing disordered about that thinking. It's very ordered, it's very rational. It's about justifying systems of oppression and exploitation on the basis that blacks are somehow inferior people who don't deserve to be treated any differently.
When they know better.
Of course they know better. Of course they know better. They know the truth, but they seek very often, I'm afraid, to deliberately shut their eyes to it. They don't seriously believe that black people are inferior, but it suits them to believe it. Let me give you an example. I heard the other day of someone who had heard the Reverend Jesse Jackson, that great presidential candidate debate that you had recently in this part of the world. All the candidates had spoken. Jesse Jackson was, of course, preeminent amongst them all, because none match his stature. My friend went into the washroom in his cubicle. A white guy came in and said, "You know, that boy really can speak. He was the best of the lot, but there's no way I can vote for him." Now, that white man knew exactly the qualities of the Reverend Jesse Jackson. He knew exactly that this man was a man above all fit to be President of the United States. But he knew also that as a white man coming from the tradition that he came from, there was no way that he could allow himself to vote a black man into that position of power, because he believed that it was fundamentally contrary to his interests.
So,
now, of course, it isn't. What we have to persuade white people is, particularly white people who haven't necessarily benefited from the system, because we'll never persuade those who have. We have to persuade those white people who haven't
we'll
benefited.
never persuade those who have.
No, I mean, if you have benefited from the system, from a system, which keeps black people in a state of subservience, it is going to be very, very hard indeed to persuade that person to alter the system in such a way that he will not benefit to the same degree. The only thing that can do that, the only way in which you can do that, is by a fundamental spiritual revolution. And that is not obtained through the ballot box, that is obtained through faith. Do you follow me? So you are not going to, through the ordinary political processes, ever persuade somebody to surrender power. But if you let me finish my...
Yeah, because you got to explain the faith
point.
part there. Go ahead.
Sure. Well, no, the faith part for very many of the people who are watching this program will be quite clear, because they go to church of a Sunday and they see and live and experience the power of Christ. And what they understand is that when you are able to make sure that that power escapes the confines of what happens on Sunday and goes out into the wide world, then there's nothing that you can't do. But you see, those people who have...
You took care of that right neatly. Go ahead.
Those people who have a vested interest in the political system are going to take some persuading ever to vote for Jesse Jackson for president. But the white person who doesn't have a vested interest, who is having a difficult time because of the recession, who is seeing his Medicare bills go up, who is, as a woman, aware of the discrimination there is against women in our society, in the United States and in Britain. Well, those people, whether they be white, black, Native American, Hispanic, can be persuaded, surely, I believe they can be, through the ordinary political processes, that there is benefit to them in having a coalition of the dispossessed who want to go somewhere, who want to go places, and who want to so order society that they do. Now, those people are the Reverend Jackson's constituency, it seems to me, and I believe that's a growing constituency, which is why one is excited, and the whole world is excited. The black diaspora is excited. White people in Britain are excited by the Reverend Jesse Jackson. He's done a great deal for America, black and white. When ordinary American politicians come to Britain, nobody gives a damn. When Jesse Jackson comes to Britain, people sit up and they look, and they respect America for him. Now, white America, that cracker who went and made that remark in that toilet, had better wake up to that fact too, if America is to be great again.
You mentioned earlier these two super white powers between which black people, Africans, are sandwiched. What do you think we should be teaching our children about how to deal with these two super white powers?
We should be teaching our children, first and foremost, that this year is a centenary of Marcus Garvey. We should remind ourselves about how he and other early Pan-Africanists, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah is an example, George Padmore another, how they had a vision of a strong and united Africa, of a continent which refused to accept the boundaries that were imposed in it under the Treaty of Berlin by colonial imperial powers, and said that we are going to seek to work together as an economic unit and as a political unit, and that we're going together with the other non-aligned nations of the world who exist between these two great superpowers to try and develop an alternative and another way, provide a space in this world for there to be another way. Now that's a political program that has to be implemented as a political program does. But it's also, you know, something that requires an attitudinal change. We have to stop as black people considering ourselves always as being a besieged minority. One thing I hate being called, I don't like it, but I can live with being called a nigger. Although if you try it, you're lucky to find yourself on the ground, but I can live with it. But what I cannot live with, and what I will not live with, is being described as an ethnic minority. I am not an ethnic minority. Even in my own constituency, the area I represent, we're over 50% of all the people, and that's in the heart of London. But in the world, Afro-Caribbean, Asian, native indigenous peoples, we make up the overwhelming majority. And we have to start thinking like a majority and organizing like a majority and not believing that somehow the fact that power is at this time centered in the hands of whites is somehow preordained. Do you know what I mean? And when we start doing that, when we start getting our heads together, we start getting a new attitude that recognizes the wealth of our culture, that recognizes our history, and that goes beyond that. Not recognizing it in a romantic, sentimental way that wallows in the long-lost glories of the past. You know, I'm not into that, but uses that as a springboard for the gains of the future. We can do it. We must do it. Because in an odd sort of way, you see, we represent the salvation of white people. White folks have made a terrible mess of this world. Look at it. It's in a state. It is not coherent. It isn't cohesive. They're in a state of spiritual crisis half the time. We don't know where they're going. And yet, native indigenous peoples, black peoples, with their own history and indeed with their own theology. Take one issue, one practical issue. The environment. Respect for nature and the land. That's rooted, you know, in the African experience. That's rooted in the experience of the Native American peoples. Respect and knowledge of the land, not destroying it, but respecting it, being part of it. We can teach that to white folks. The whole issue of the elderly and care of the elderly. You know, black people, Native American people, Hispanic peoples have been caring for their elderly since time immemorial. We have a vision of the extended family that's all embracing. It isn't putting people in little boxes and then sending granny off to some home somewhere. You know what I mean? It's recognizing the grandmother, the grandfather, the ancestor as being valid. You know, that is the way forward. That's the way to a better life. We can teach that to white folks.
You have often spoken of the fact that many times you hear people say that the Jews built pyramids, the pyramids in Egypt. Would you expound on that, please?
If you could build a pyramid before you're born, you're more than God. Because even God have never done anything before God existed. You know? When they said God created the world, first they tell us God come into being by God's self. So God got to be here to do something here. All right. The pyramids of Egypt, there are 72 total. They're around the central part of Egypt in today's geography. Those pyramids that mostly certain Jewish people go and stand on, such as Mayor Koch came and Begin, Prime Minister Begin came and stood on, that particular pyramid is the one of Khufu, whom Herodotus later came and called Cheops. That pyramid was built in the 4th dynasty. The first Jew, Abraham, wasn't born until the 13th dynasty. If I was born in the 13th dynasty, how could I build a pyramid in the 4th dynasty? That means the pyramid was built 2200 and at BC. I am born in 1675 BC, and I built the pyramid before I was born.
There's a very important baptism scene here. Could you tell us about that, please?
That behind you is the baptismal scene. You see God, Tahuti, this God of scribes, baptizing along, let me see which God it is, at this case, God Horus, baptizing the Pharaoh. In order for the Pharaoh to be coronated, he must be purified. He's going through the purification rite. You see the 2 bottles of holy water, but the holy water is symbolized by 2 symbols, the Ankh and the Was, intermittently arranged.
Africa gave birth to queens like Nzinga, a death-defying diva and visionary political leader. When she became Queen of Ndongo, she organized the Money Congo, baptized and by Portuguese missionaries. She was the first to realize the misuse of Christianity, conquest, church, and slave trade, all inseparable, all the same, the unholy trinity, opposed to African serenity. Her chief claim to fame, she renounced her Christian name, survived her reign, and became an African abolitionist.
Melanin, for the common person, we normally recognize it as the pigment that we find in our skin, in our hair, in our eyes. And that's about all that we see of it. And we basically look at it as just there as being a cosmetic thing. So the layperson really looks at melanin as just a coloring, a pigmentation. But when the scientists look at it, it's a very, very involved, very highly complex, very functional system. And this is what happens when there's a reduced amount of melanin in the skin or in other organs throughout the body. Now this happens externally. We see this all the time. But what we don't translate is that in all of those regions internally where there is no melanin or low concentrations of melanin, that same thing is happening.